Rhodes's big idea from the Boer War by Thomas Packenham. In a secret letter to Alfred Beit in August 1895, when they hatched the plot to create a revolution in Johannesburg, supported by a raid from Pitsani and Mafeking, led by Dr. Jameson, Cecil Rhodes said the following: Johannesburg is ready. This is the big idea which makes England dominant in Africa. In fact, gives England the African continent. Johannesburg was not ready. That was the message of the last 6 code telegrams to Dr. Jameson. They confirmed his fears. So did a verbal report from Major Heaney, the special messenger sent by the Johannesburg Reform Committee, the leaders of Rhodes's and Beit's revolutionary movement in the Transvaal. The flotation, as they called the rising in which they proposed to seize Johannesburg, was going to be a flop. The revolutionaries were in a funk. Dead against it. Fiasco. You must not move. Too awful. Very sorry. Ichabod. Jameson left Heaney in the white belt tent at Pitsani, his camp in Bechuanaland, within a few miles of the borders of both the Cape Colony and the Transvaal. Heaney himself never doubted Jameson's reaction. He had warned the committee. He'll come in, sure as fate. For 20 minutes on that hot Sunday afternoon, 29 December 1895, Jameson paced up and down in the sand outside the tent. Then he called to Heaney. He was going in, despite everything. Damn them. He'd lick the burghers all round the Transvaal. If the fellows at Johannesburg wouldn't start the rising as agreed, their hands would have to be forced. It was a chance of a lifetime. At any rate, he wasn't spending another day at Pitsani Potlucko. Boot and saddle! Dust swirled across the parade ground as the grey-suited, slouch-hatted Rhodesian police paraded in a hollow square. Dress by the left! Bugler! Defiantly the bugle calls echoed off the tin walls of the single store at Pitsani and floated across the 3 miles of empty white veld between Pitsani and the invisible Transvaal frontier. Silence except for the shuffling of the troopers' horses, branded CC on their rumps, and the hum of the wind in the single telegraph wire. Jameson had nearly 400 Rhodesian mounted police at Pitsani, belonging to the Chartered Company. It was this company, created by Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Beit, that administered the new British colony of Rhodesia under Crown Charter. Many of the police looked like colonials. They had that swagger, the loose seat in the saddle, and the easy lift and fall of the carbine on their hips. Jameson had collected another 120 volunteers, 25 miles away at Mafeking, just within the borders of the Cape Colony. That brought the total of the Chartered Company force up to about 600, if one counted those who led the spare horses. Jameson had originally planned to invade the Transvaal with 1,500. With 600, it did seem a bit of a tall order. 1 regiment against the whole Boer army. But Jameson and the Rhodesian troopers had faced hopeless odds before. They had crushed Lobengula, king of the Matabele, in 1892. 600 against 6,000 Matabeles. This new expedition, according to Cecil Rhodes, would be easier than Matabeleland. At Pitsani, after 6 months' work, Jameson had scraped together 6 Maxim machine guns, 2 7-pounder mountain guns, and a 12.5-pounder field piece. Some other refinements were stacked on the wagons, beside the black tin trunks of Sir John Willoughby and the staff. A cask of Cape brandy for the men, and crates of champagne for the officers. Otherwise, they had cut the baggage train to the bone. The plan was to make a 3-day dash for Johannesburg before the Boer commandos could mobilize. Unfortunately, rumours about the rising, babbling was Jameson's word, had already reached the local papers. So it was now or never. Of course, it was a wild gamble, this dash for Johannesburg. But then so was much of the work of Rhodes' chartered company, and in fact, much of the history of the British Empire. Clive would have done it, Jameson told a friend. He was sure of that. If Jameson gambled and won, if they could rush Johannesburg into a rising and forcibly take over the Transvaal, they would be forgiven the illegality. If they gambled and lost, well, the usual penalty was death. Death, but not necessarily defeat. It was one of the lessons of history that it needed a disaster to make the British interested in their empire. They seemed to prefer dead generals to living generals. They avenged them by completing their work. At least half the empire had been conquered by dead men. People could see the process happening in the Sudan. Any day now, the British would avenge Gordon by taking over the whole of the Mahdi's country. Already the same process was happening in the Transvaal, ever since the Battle of Majuba, where General Colley and 400 men had been cut up by the Boers 14 years before. Jameson knew what his staff officers felt about Majuba. They all came from decent regiments. Johnny Willoughby from the Horse Guards, Gray from the Inniskillings, Bobby White from the Welsh Fusiliers. It was British officers like this who took Majuba personally. Not just the thought of those brave fellows who died, also the shame of others who had raised the white flag. Majuba was unfinished business for the British Army, something to wipe off the slate. In the gathering dusk the bugle sounded. Captain Lindsell and a dozen scouts clattered off down the rutted wagon road, then turned east towards the darkness. There could be no going back now. Jameson mounted a black stallion. He took off his felt hat, and there were 3 ringing cheers for the Queen. Then they trotted out of Pitsani, followed by the African servants and the mule carts. The moon had risen, flashing on the tin walls of the village and the brass and steel mountings of the Maxims, before the column was engulfed in dust. Across the border and into the Transvaal rode the 600. 4 days had passed, and the morning of the 2nd of January found Jameson's column halted close to a small whitewashed farm south of a koppie called Doornkop, in the brown grassy hills of the Rand. They had ridden 170 miles into the Transvaal, with hardly a halt for sleep. The troopers were slipping from side to side in their saddles, and the officers were mixed with the men. Ahead was their goal, Johannesburg, the Golden City, only a couple of hours' ride away. As dawn broke, they could see the endless lines of tall iron chimneys, the gigantic wheels above the mine shafts, and the gleam of the mine tailings, the golden slag in that lunar landscape. And their goal might indeed have been the moon, for all their chances of getting there. Betrayal, that was the only word for it. Johannesburg had not risen. Their friends had made their peace with President Kruger and his Boers. This news had been brought to Jameson by two bicyclists. Not one armed volunteer had ridden out to join the column. Now Jameson's path was barred by a relentless and invisible enemy. By 8 o'clock, Jameson's little band had suffered 65 killed and wounded. Inspector Cazalet was hit in the chest, Major Coventry in the spine. Captain Barry was dying. And then reality, at last, broke into Jameson's world of make-believe. Someone lifted a white flag. Not a very good white flag, but the best they could do in the circumstances. It was made from the white apron of an African servant girl. The firing ceased. From all around them, the Boers rose up out of the ground, like ants, as one officer put it. Most of the Boers were dressed in ordinary brown working clothes, but a few had come straight from New Year festivities and had slung their rifles and bandoliers over their black Sunday best. The Boers disarmed the British, assisted the wounded, and seized the baggage. In Bobby White's black tin box were found the code telegrams from Rhodes in the Cape and from the other plotters in Johannesburg. There was a spare copy of the woman and children letter and a code book to go with the code telegrams. It lay among the empty champagne bottles. The humiliation was complete when the dead were counted before burial. The British had lost 16, the Boers 1 man, 1 fewer than they had lost at Majuba. Weeping, Jameson was led away in a cart to the jail at Pretoria.